And then someone sent me a little while ago this trailer for Geniuses, National Geographic's Genius series, which is going to pick up again the discussion and juxtaposition of Malcolm X against or related to Dr. King. Get your Vernon philosophies together and let's check the trailer. So, already right there in the trailer, you see a couple of things. You see the similar framing that we've often gotten. King and Malcolm weren't that different, or King and Malcolm were thought to be different, but were they that? How different were they? What were their similarities? They both wanted the same thing. They had the same goals. You see Peniel Joseph already in there as the key voice, sort of narrating the trailer already, setting this tone for what appears to be the updating of the standard approach. King was nonviolent, Malcolm was violent. They both went through some changes. Usually that's described as King, quote unquote, sort of politically softening and moving to his right to adopt a more Kingian sort of politics. King is never credited or rarely credited or acknowledged with moving ever more to his left politically, and if showing that the joining of forces that was developing between Malcolm and Martin was evolving more on the basis of Malcolm's radical politics than anything else. But yet and still it is that juxtaposition of one against the other, with what appears to be the attempt to tell us that to the extent that, as the counterintelligence program said of Dr. King, he adhered to white liberalism and nonviolence, he was acceptable. Similar to what we've already discussed in terms of Peniel Joseph's work around Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, and Malcolm X, to the extent that they moved left of the Democratic Party, left of sort of mainstream civil rights consensus, they lost value, lost their way, lost their relevance. With Joseph's involvement here, I will and happily be checked if I'm wrong, continue to assume initially that that's the frame that's going to be brought here. That, in other words, that they are going to be juxtaposed against one another, and to the extent that one is or the other is redeemable, it will be on the basis of them moving ever to the right to a more liberal, I might call neoliberal politic, et cetera, and so forth. And in each case, the actual radical politics that Malcolm and Martin dealt with will not be centered, given, just due, focused, if included or referenced even at all. All right, but if we look a little bit at this Variety article, I think it gives a little bit more context to my own initial thoughts and gives us a little more information about what is the attempt here. So, Genius MLK X set to premiere date. It's going to be in February, just in time for Black History Month, of course, with the first two episodes appearing on February 1st. But as it says here, unlike past seasons, this season of Genius will tell the story of two geniuses: civil rights movement leaders, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. Rest in peace, Andre Brower. I just see that he passed, and I see that I was actually a big fan of his, particularly back in the day on Homicide, and his interrogation box scenes are classic in terms of good writing, I think, and good propaganda. It was well done propaganda, but a big fan of his, and of course he did propaganda as well on Brooklyn Nine-Nine. But that contradiction notwithstanding, he did it very well. He was a brilliant actor, and I am sorry for his loss, and peace to his family. But as Variety continues here, the official description of the season states that it will follow both King and X from their formative years, where they were molded by strong fathers and traumatic injustices, to their rich parallel stories as they shaped their identities and became the change they wished to see in the world. Influenced as children by different upbringings and experiences, King by the Jim Crow era South and life in the church, before finding his voice at Morehouse and Boston University, and X growing up under constant deadly violence of the Klan and falling into a life of vice and incarceration, where he was introduced to the Nation of Islam and found his voice. The two visionaries ultimately rose to pioneer a movement. You can see here some of the people featured in as cast. I'm sure they're very talented and beautiful people. But what is of most interest to me is this part here where there's a discussion and description of the think tank of historians and experts who served as production consultants prior to the start of the writer's room to guide the production, including in alphabetical order, Jamal Joseph, who I did reach out to and invited to discuss this, and should he ever respond, I'll let you all know, and maybe he'll join us here, and if not here, elsewhere, and we'll happily check that out as well. But of course, my main concern is seeing this. We already heard his voice and saw him featured prominently in the trailer. I'm not at all surprised and have been predicting for going on almost 2 decades now that Joseph would become a permanent problem in reproducing a neoliberal narrative of Black radical histories and individuals. Links to previous work on that and even our debate, I'll put in the show description. You can check that out for yourselves. But I'm not surprised, and again, have even predicted he would be here. Barbara Reynolds, if folks want to go back, I'll make sure that's in the show description as well. She is discussed by my godfather, Mr. Tom Porter, in a very critical way for her versions of him and Jesse Jackson in her previous work. Noted here, Jesse Jackson's America's David. And I also would want to note Jeff Stetson because it says here that the meeting he authored, of course, the famous play going back several decades now, the meeting between Dr. King and Malcolm X, a fictional depiction of them having a meeting. I did go back and watch it, a version of it at least on YouTube, and was reminded of what I've always thought it to be a very, with all due respect, sophomoric introduction to the two men, and that does what I fear is being done in a new version in this forthcoming film. It just sort of sets up that base again, sophomoric juxtaposition of King versus Malcolm. And what if we had put down our what if we had joined forces earlier, and what we could have done. Again, no real discussion of their radical politics, ever increasing, particularly for Dr. King. No discussion of the state. No discussion of the counterintelligence program. No discussion of the assassinations. No discussion of all of the broader anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, radical politics that both men were increasingly involved with and targeted and assassinated for. So it's perfect that he would be involved here, not only as having been the inspiration for the series, but having written the pilot for it and serving as executive producer. So I think these are warning signs as to what we can expect we're going to get from this forthcoming series. Now, also, as this Blavity article reminds us, this is a Disney product. Disney owns National Geographic, or I think 70+% of it. It's airing on Hulu, which is a Disney product. So we should be reminded of this, and we've discussed this previously about what this means, and I'll even put the link in the show description where we talked about not only what this means in terms of these histories becoming Disney products, but that Disney and what it means when Disney and Disney-like companies are actually the ones owning the likenesses to these figures like Malcolm X. I don't think it's Disney in particular that owns Malcolm's likeness, but that company is discussed in that video we did about a year or so ago. So I'll put that in the link description. The point being, these histories, these images, these likenesses, these windows to our past are not controlled by us. They're not owned by us. They're not designed with a frame for us to access these histories and people for any act for the purposes that those people themselves had. and for us to pick up the radical traditions that they represented and to advance them. That's not why they exist. They exist to do quite the opposite. That was, and again, is the point of the comical reference both to the Vernon philosophy of black media avoidance, to the penny trick of Peniel Joseph, the nominal reference to individuals and histories that are themselves radical and revolutionary, but are depicted in very neoliberal frames, so that when they are passed on to our youth, again, much like the fifth tenet of the counterintelligence program directed at black communities, mandates in a way that will discourage black youth from becoming radical. And as the oppression of black people continues, there needs to be a constant assault on the consciousness of those communities, and in particular, the radical traditions that might inform revolutionary responses to that ongoing oppression. So, just as we see here, now I did mention, I think I mentioned it in, maybe it was in another instance or edit, but I thought that it would be interesting to do a series that focused on Betty and Coretta. If you're going to juxtapose people, it would be interesting to see if those two are would be actually given the due that they deserve as individuals, and also representatives of broader histories and struggles. Uh, what would it would be interesting to see them get uh, centered, but again, not here. As much as I would like to see the lives of Betty Shabazz and Coretta Scott King depicted and given more attention, I don't want it to be in the context that their husbands are constantly posthumously abused. Uh, but according to Blavity, this series is going to bring their wives, Coretta Scott King and Betty Shabazz, who are often portrayed as peripheral figures, to the forefront, and shows them as formidable equals of the movement. And then it goes on to point out, as we saw in the trailer, that neither Malcolm nor Martin would have become who they were without the other. So, also, again, I want to just quickly bring up a point or two I made, or have been trying to make in for a number of years, and is discussed in this presentation that I put together some years ago. And the one attempt at a Prezi I ever engaged, it's not a very well done Prezi. The content is dope and accurate, of course, but the presentation it is what it is. But there's a couple points from this that I wanted to make that are I think predictably coming up again in this framing, and the way Malcolm and Martin are juxtaposed. Now, again, there is, I think, a valuable way it could be done. That is the juxtaposition of Malcolm against Martin, the kinds of politics they represented, the paths to their conclusions that they took, et cetera, and so forth. I think there is value there. I think some of that work has been done well in the past. I was even thinking, James Cone had a book, I think, comparing the two of them and their religious approaches or something like that. Maybe we should get a copy for Diallo. But what is often done is as I think is described in some of the research I found for this presentation some years ago, that I think is still of value here. So I just wanted to bring renewed attention to it. First, just again to remind, immediately after the March on Washington, William Sullivan, working on behalf of the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover, was already saying that we must mark Dr. King now, if we have not done so before, as the most dangerous Negro of the future of this nation from the standpoint of communism, the Negro, and national security. We've talked about this before repeatedly. This was also in the context of a fear that King's leadership would take black people towards an affinity for and defense of and solidarity with the Cuban Revolution. So even with the relatively soft and liberal I Have a Dream speech, Dr. King was already moving beyond mainstream civil rights, what was sanctionable by the state and mainstream civil rights, and it was noted already by the highest levels and the most vicious levels of the federal government. So what I've always just wanted to quickly try to point out, and again, we can assess this, and I'll predict that it's not going to appear uh, in this forthcoming series, but this is sort of the point that I've been trying to make as it relates to these two, and that how we see them, what we see not considered when each are themselves considered individually, or certainly again in juxtaposition against the other. And that is just quickly, in each case, Malcolm and Martin, they both express deep commitments to Black unity and extending that unity to global anti colonial and anti imperial struggles. Both expressed a fealty to anti capitalist ideas. Both expressed strong and particular criticism of the Black bourgeoisie and white liberals. Both expressed zero confidence in legislation and conventional methods of protest politics. Again, both were advocating that we differently approach electoral politics, not simply voting for the lesser of evils or to stop one or another fascist, this, that, or the other. And then lastly, both express support for direct action campaigns. And I don't know to what extent, particularly that point will be made clear. I have zero confidence that point will be made clear in this series. If anything, they're going to try to make it seem like that Malcolm was walking away from armed struggle and King towards a King that was seen as representing those politics. But even as the counterintelligence program documents stated themselves, they were concerned that if King left his obedience for liberalism and nonviolent doctrines, he would become the number one threat to the state. But it was his direct action campaigns and advocacy calls that made him the threat and that are often ignored when King is himself considered. Malcolm never disavowed armed struggle, self defense, and even guerrilla warfare. So we can be, I guarantee that will not be depicted correctly, if at all, in this series. But that is a point that should always be considered and remembered. Now, specifically, the argument of Powell and Amundsen is something I still think is vitally important when we understand when we try to understand how King and X both were politically in their lives, but how they're depicted posthumously. And as they wrote, the media created an image of Malcolm X as a violent, power hungry extremist who was primarily interested in harming the white population in the United States. And that's why Wendy Wolf, the Viking Press publisher and editor for Manning Marable's a Life of Reinvention, expressed that fear of Malcolm and what he represented to her community of white liberals. Contrasting Malcolm X with Martin Luther King Jr. in the media fostered this negative image. The two men were described as opposite ends of a spectrum. King is advocating nonviolence. X is advocating violence. King is a black minister. X is an ex-convict. King is a civil rights leader. X is a racial fanatic. And I'm sure, to whatever extent that Genius and Disney tried to adjust this frame, it will be to show that Malcolm was much more like King than we would want, and much more like the King they would want us to think King was than the King that actually was. Similarly, they wrote, Black Muslims and thus Malcolm X were characterized as extremists within the media. The media created this image with the terms used to describe Malcolm X and Black Muslims: anti-Christian, anti-white, alienation, agitators, Black supremacy, bitter, confrontation, cult, enemy, extremist, exploit, hate, militant, separation, sect, threat, and trouble. These terms appeared frequently and with high intensity, shaping a negative image of Malcolm X in the media. The New York Times, in particular, constructed oppositional identities of the two leaders. Malcolm X was framed as a doppelganger to King. They were portrayed as opposite men with opposite goals. And I'm not going to belabor the point here, but I did just want to quickly show again the article, the story that came out from earlier this year that we covered in our discussion with Dr. Burroughs of Jonathan Eag's new book on Dr. King and all of its flaws. Eag was pointing out the I don't know, revelation that if it was to some, that the quote that is often or had been often attributed to Dr. King condemning the work of Malcolm X was itself false, wasn't reported accurately, it wasn't true. And my point in bringing it up here is that is only to say that there have always been, and has in addition to the media description I just covered a moment ago, there has always been an effort to distort the relationship between King and X and to distort each of them individually in and post their lives. So to see Genius and Disney coming back again to do their version of this or to update that constant juxtaposition and false representation of each and false comparisons to each and false dichotomies created for each through each, just as a quick reminder, there's a history and a legacy of this being an issue. We have to stay vigilant on our Vernon philosophy. And again, remember, Vernon philosophy isn't calling for a material boycott. It is an intellectual boycott. It is saying, I know many of us are going to engage these media products. Our people, our students, our families are going to engage these media products. And I do think we have to be able to offer up an analysis and a critique, but also to have some prophylactic protection of sorts, intellectual prophylactic protection, self-defensive fitness, again, as Chuck D and Public Enemy once said, and being reminded of what the Vernon philosophy holds as its core tenet, that oppressed people, colonized people, Black people in particular here in the United States, cannot, should not look to see themselves or accurate depictions of themselves in mainstream commercial media. All that is popular is fraudulent. All that is popular is a false claim and representation, or worse, is a conscious attempt at psychological warfare against the people in the subjects it claims to represent.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.